Chapter 087 Agents of the Crown. Deep in the jungles of Koth, in what was otherwise an unremarkable patch of rainforest, a situation was unfolding. The trees shook, the animals vacated the area in panic, and the underbrush was trampled underfoot as a gigantic, furious hydra thundered through the area in pursuit of its target. Its 8 heads fanned out and snapped angrily towards anything in the vicinity that failed to get out of its way, breaking low-hanging branches and killing any animal that was too slow to flee. As for Zorian, who was its target, he simply kept running and dodging while marveling at the incredible speed with which the hydra was able to move through the thick vegetation of the rainforest. He had thought its size would make maneuvering difficult and allow him to easily keep ahead of it, but he had seriously underestimated its ability to just plow through everything in front of it without stopping. He was purposely running through the most difficult terrain he could find, and he never even came close to losing it. It was constantly trailing just behind him. A blue, translucent, ectoplasmic eye constantly trailed after Zorian, hovering above his head and staring at the hydra. It was through this eye that Zorian was able to keep track of the hydra's movements and dodge its attacks, despite having his back turned to it. Otherwise, if he were forced to run blind or had to periodically slow down to turn around, the hydra would have grabbed him 100 times by now. Though the spell itself was very simple, very few people would be able to process information from 2 different perspectives like that. The fact Zorian could look both in front of him and behind him at the same time, while maneuvering through a treacherous, obstacle-filled jungle floor was proof that his experiments with mental enhancement were bearing some fruit. The chase led them next to a fallen, rotting log covered in moss and mushrooms. Without its main body slowing down at all, one of the hydra's 8 heads reached down and bit into it, lifting it out of the ground and launching it at Zorian. Half a dozen monstrous centipedes and one very terrified squirrel tumbled out of the rotting log as it sailed through the air, having hidden in it when they noticed the rampaging hydra approaching. Zorian reacted instantly, making a few silent movements and causing a bright red ectoplasmic hand to materialize in the air behind him and slap the log aside. It collided with the nearby tree where it exploded into a shower of rotting wood. Both Zorian and the hydra simply charged through the cloud of wood and shrapnel, one with the aid of magical shields and the other through the power of supernatural toughness and regeneration. "Zack, what the hell are you doing there?" Zorian yelled. "I've been running for ages here. Did you figure out the dagger or not?" Zack, who was trailing behind both of them while occasionally making funny poses and waving the dagger in his hand at the hydra, seemed to pause at the question. "It's hard, okay," he yelled back. "I'm running low on mana here," Zorian said. "If you don't figure it out soon, I'm calling this off." In truth, the hydra posed very little threat to Zorian. If the situation ever got too dangerous, he could have always teleported away or simply flown away too high for the hydra to reach. However, that would leave it free to turn around and shift its attention to Zack, which would defeat the whole purpose of the setup. The point of him leading the hydra on the merry chase through the Gothic jungle was to give Zack the time he needed to figure out how to use the dagger on the hydra. Something that didn't seem to be going too well. Oh well. On the bright side, if Zack couldn't figure it out by the time Zorian ran out of mana, it would be Zorian's turn next. Zorian would actually prefer if he was the one who figured out how to use the dagger, since he and Zack had agreed that whoever succeeded at this would get to own the hydra. He had a good feeling about his chances, since, unlike Zack, he had soul perception unlocked. Surely that would. "Hydra!" Zack suddenly shouted, dramatically pointing the dagger in the monster's direction. "I am your master now. Kneel before me." No less than 3 of the hydras had glanced towards Zack, giving him a hateful, contemptuous look before returning their attention to Zorian again. Before Zorian could say anything, Zack suddenly teleported right on top of the Hydra and plunged the dagger straight into its back. Zorian wanted to scream at his fellow time traveler for being such an idiot. Not only had Zack exposed himself to incredible danger, since the Hydra's heads could twist backwards to reach people foolish enough to climb on its back with incredible speed and ease, the boy had also invalidated all the effort Zorian invested into making sure the Hydra was focused on him and him alone. Even if Zack got away from this stunt completely unscathed, and he probably would, in all honesty, the Hydra would no longer ignore him from this point onward. Indeed, the moment Zack popped into existence on top of the Hydra's back, before he even finished plunging the dagger into its flesh, the monster was already stopping its charge, all 8 of its heads refocusing on the sudden new threat. However, the moment the dagger sank into its back, a strange thing happened. Instead of simply ignoring the puny wand and biting down on Zack anyway, the Hydra suddenly stiffened as if paralyzed. Its many heads froze in the air, jaws still stretched wide for a lethal bite, staring at Zack with confused, uncomprehending eyes. "No way!" Zorian complained weakly. "Ha ha!" Zack laughed, wrenching the dagger out of the wound and quickly straightening himself up. The Hydra's back not being the most stable of grounds, he almost lost his balance upon doing that and had to spend several seconds to stabilize himself. The Hydra remained completely motionless throughout all of that. Zack slapped the closest Hydra head a few times playfully. "What did I tell you, eh? I really am your master now. Kneel." The command seemed to break the Hydra out of its paralysis. Without hesitation, it dropped to the ground. Being a quadrupedal lifeform, it couldn't really exactly kneel as such, so it instead just dropped on its stomach and lowered its many heads on the ground. The sudden motion completely unbalanced Zack, however, sending him tumbling down the creature's back with a strangled cry. He hit the ground with a dull thud, landing on one of the exposed rocks, and then spent the next minute and a half rolling around in pain on the ground. Zorian eyed the Hydra for a few seconds before deciding not to approach for now. It was no longer attacking him, but he had a feeling that might change if he made any moves towards its new master. "There is no way that was the correct command phrase to activate the dagger, is it?" he eventually asked. "Ugh. Damn, this hurt," said Zack, laboriously rising to his feet while using the nearby Hydra as a stabilizer. He did his best to dust himself off and get rid of the branches and bugs stuck in his hair. And no, that wasn't the command phrase. The way to activate the dagger is to first cut yourself with it to establish resonance and then cut the Hydra to forge a bond with it and finalize the deal. Zorian gave him a curious look. "How the hell did you figure that out?" "I accidentally cut myself with it while trying to mess around with it while running," Zack admitted with an awkward laugh. He turned towards the Hydra, whose many eyes diligently followed his every move. "Anyway, who cares about that? It doesn't matter how I discovered the dagger's usage, all that matters is that the Hydra is finally mine." "Well, ours, but you know." Yeah, I know," Zorian said, clacking his tongue. He'd normally be annoyed about losing a bet like that, but it was probably better this way. There was no guarantee he would have uncovered such a curious method of activation himself. He felt the Hydra's mind a little. He kind of expected to find the Hydra resentful of being effectively enslaved like this, but he found the creature to be mostly curious instead. Confused and a little scared too, but mostly just curious. It did not seem to harbor any ill will towards Zack. Zorian had never heard of a monster control method that was that thorough and effective, and the Hydra should be highly resistant to mind control due to its unique mind anyway. He had a feeling this was more than just control. In some strange way, the Hydra was conditioned to regard the bond forged by the dagger as innately legitimate and did not struggle against its bindings at all. Zorian was torn between being impressed by the maker of the dagger for pulling it off and disturbed that such a thing was possible. In any case, the friendliness was only towards Zack. The moment Zorian tried to step closer, the Hydra immediately jumped to its feet and interposed itself between Zorian and its master, hissing and snapping its jaws at him menacingly. "Oh come on," Zorian complained. "That guy doesn't need your protection from me. If anything, I would need to be protected against him if we seriously fought." The Hydra didn't understand human speech, and probably wouldn't have listened to him even if it did. It was about to lunge at Zorian when Zack placed his hand on its flank and stopped it. "Hey, knock it off," Zack said. "That guy is our friend, okay? No eating friends." It took a few gestures and shouting before the Hydra managed to understand what its new owner was telling it, at which point it gave Zack something reminiscent of an incredulous look, as if unable to believe Zack would be friendly to someone like Zorian, who had led it on a wild goose chase for a better part of an hour. I know. He can be very annoying, but he's very useful and mostly means well," Zack said sagely, patting the Hydra gently on the flank. The Hydra directed one last unhappy hiss in Zorian's direction before grudgingly standing down and indicating it would allow him to get close without attacking him. "Possibly." Zorian folded his hands over his chest and gave Zack an unamused look. "Don't worry, I'm sure she'll warm up to you in time," Zack told him, grinning widely. "Princess is just a little shy." "What? What?" Zorian blurted out. "It's a she," Zack said, nodding sagely. "I know, I was a little surprised myself when I felt that through the link and—" "No, not that," Zorian snapped. "You're seriously naming a Hydra princess?" "Why not?" Zack challenged. "What's wrong with that name?" The newly named princess focused three of her heads on him, as if daring him to say anything. Stupid reptile. It didn't even understand what they were talking about but felt the need to side with Zack anyway. "It's a stupid name," Zorian told him bluntly. "It's a great name," Zack disagreed. "A royal name for a very royal girl. She's a divinely empowered guardian of an imperial item. That's pretty high-ranked if you ask me. Plus, you know how royals like to refer to themselves in plural? We this and we that. Well, Princess here can talk about herself in plural and be completely factual. So there. It's actually very clever, and you were just too judgmental to figure it out." "Ugh," Zorian grunted. "If that's your logic, why not call her Queen instead?" "Because Princess is a more ironic name for a giant Hydra," Zack admitted. Zorian spent the next 15 minutes trying to argue the issue before giving up. It took another hour after that to coax Princess back into the Imperial Orb for transport. She wanted to follow around after Zack like a puppy, and was confused why he wanted to abandon her in the orb so soon after their bonding. Zorian had to say, watching Zack awkwardly try to convince a clingy Hydra that he would be back and that she should stay put was kind of amusing. Perhaps it was a good thing that Zack ended up winning that bet after all. Break. After recovering the Imperial Orb and tentatively subduing the Hydra guarding it, Zack and Zorian turned their attention towards the Solrotham at the Ziggurat of the Sun and the Imperial Ring in their possession. They already knew they could steal their ring if they launched a big enough attack on them, but that took a great deal of time and effort. Well, the presence of Princess on the battlefield would probably make an all-out assault a little easier this time around, but it would still be a major undertaking that would consume a lot of their time and resources that would be better spent elsewhere. "It's a pity Princess is too big to fit in the Ziggurat corridors," lamented Zack. "Otherwise we could just climb on top of her and charging, trampling and brushing aside any Solrotham that got in our way. If our attack was that unstoppable, the Solrotham would probably just pick up whatever they can and flee," pointed out Zorian. "They'd probably flee underground," and it would be an utter pain to track them down then. Not to mention they have a massive sandworm on their side. We don't want to get in an underground battle with them, I think, even with Princess on our side. HMPH, Zack mumbled unhappily. How about we just infiltrate a ziggurat through this underground connection, then? We might be able to avoid a massive battle that way. They have their pet sandworm constantly guarding that, Zorian pointed out, shaking his head sadly. I bet we're noticed instantly through whatever exotic senses that thing has. And then it collapses the whole tunnel on top of us before we can do anything. Considering the layout of their dungeon entrance, I think it was made by the worm in the first place, so they probably have no qualms about destroying it. They can always command the sandworm to create another one later. Zack was silent for a while. How about just soul-killing the entire colony? Zack finally asked. I mean, it makes me a little uncomfortable to use tactics like that, but this is pretty much what the damn knife was made for. It's definitely an option, Zorian said after a short pause. However, we probably wouldn't be able to get all Solrotham with this, and we don't know how many of them know about the ring and its importance. If we kill most of the colony but one of the survivors takes the ring and runs, things could get really bad. Right now we know where the ring is. If a shattered group of Solrotham survivors takes the ring and spends a day or two running around in the desert or, gods forbid, the depths of the dungeon. Yeah, you're right, Zack said. It's too risky. Even if we get them all, there are neighboring Solrotham tribes and other denizens of the desert to consider. If they discover the state of the ziggurat and loot the ring before we reach it, we would still have a problem on our hands. Speaking of the neighboring Solrotham tribes, do we still go forward with the idea of arranging an alliance with them? Zorian asked. The idea is nice, I admit, but it may very well take more time and effort to do it that way than to just send our own army at the ziggurat. Not if we use Princess, Zack declared triumphantly. You want to use the damn Hydra for everything these days, Zorian scoffed. You're like a little kid who just got himself a new toy and now wants to show it to everyone. How the hell will that thing help us convince the Solrotham faster? There is no need to be jealous, Zorian, Zack chided. You lost the bet fair and square. In any case, I think you greatly underestimate the impression of power we will project when we show up with a giant menacing Hydra in tow. I bet those tribes will be tripping over themselves to stay on our good side after seeing that. Or they'll be too scared to even talk to us, Zorian pointed out. Then we just smash them until they're willing to listen, Zack shrugged. This is starting to sound a lot less like arranging an alliance and a lot more like us bullying the neighboring tribes into being our reluctant army, Zorian pointed out. I think of it more as an aggressive demonstration than bullying, Zack said dismissively. We would have had to prove our strength for them to take us seriously, anyway. But really, so what if we end up cowing them into submission forcefully? We're already attacking the ziggurat tribe without any provocation. We lost the moral high ground a long time ago, I think. True. All right, said Zorian. Let's try to make them willing allies if possible, though. I have another task I want to give them, and they probably won't try very hard if our overwhelming force is all that keeps them in line. Oh. Something important? Zack asked. Maybe, Zorian answered. There is a magical creature called a tunneler toad, which lives deep within the Xlotic desert. They live in a series of hidden worlds left by some forgotten ancient civilization, called Ishmaeli reservoirs by the ancient Ecosians, because they seem designed primarily as water reservoirs. They are basically large caverns full of water, enclosed in their own pocket dimensions. The reservoirs are largely uninteresting, but the tunneler toads themselves have a curious ability to detect pocket dimensions and enter them with ease. In their natural habitat they use this to pass in and out of the Ishmaeli reservoirs as they please, using them as a hidden nesting ground, but the ability is said to be usable on any pocket dimension they come across. Ah, I see, this is for that blood magic initiative you want to set up, Zack said. Why do you need the Solrotham's help for this, though? If the toads live only around these reservoir things, they should be easy to find. It's not like the reservoirs can move, right? They are static, but I'm afraid the records of where the reservoirs are located have all been lost in the cataclysm, and no one had bothered to track them down again as far as I can tell, Zorian said, shaking his head. With much of the interior now covered in desert and taken over by Solrotham tribes and worse, the reservoirs have become extremely isolated. Not to mention that most people are neither master dimensionalists nor tunneler toads, so they would be unable to track down and enter these hidden worlds even if they wanted to. Thus, if we want to find tunneler toads, we must find a desert native that has heard about strange toads that sometimes seemingly vanish into thin air, only to just as suddenly reappear later. Annoying, Zack remarked with a frown. Is this really necessary? We have lots of candidates for ability theft when it comes to magical creatures with relevant abilities. None of them are easy to track down, Zorian pointed out. Not only are they rare and mostly extinct near human-dominated territories, the very nature of their abilities means these creatures can hide and retreat with incredible ease. The other may very well be even more annoying to find. If you think tunneler toads are bad, wait till you hear how annoying it is to track down a phase spider without it taking the initiative to reveal itself. Right, Zack said, clacking his tongue unhappily. I guess I'll try to be a little nicer to the stupid wasps. He paused for a second. So we're really going to start dabbling in blood magic and enhancement rituals in this restart, then? Yes. Although we should start with something relatively easy and well-tested, Zorian confirmed. Eagle Eye's enhancement, for instance. Or any of the simple physical enhancements that aim to improve the user's strength, stamina, regeneration and so on. Well-known, straightforward things that are unlikely to go catastrophically wrong when attempted by beginners like us. Not really instilling me with a sense of confidence here, Zorian, Zack complained. What can I say? Zorian shrugged. Blood magic is dangerous. If it makes you feel any better, I will be going first. It does not, Zack said. We both know it will be me who is to take the biggest risks in regards to this. I have way more mana to burn on permanent enhancements and I am also proficient in medical magic, so I will be able to push my limits more and understand life force manipulation way better than you. Zorian didn't dispute him. While he had no intention of piling most of the risk on Zack, his fellow time traveler was likely right in his prediction. Don't make such a grim face, Zack said dismissively. I already agreed we should do this when we talked before, didn't I? I didn't change my mind. I kind of feel I'm pressuring you over this, Zorian admitted. I'm not that easy to pressure, Zack assured him. You've been trying to pressure me to let you inspect my mind for a long time now, for instance, and I have never let you do it. I still think that's a mistake, Zorian told him. And the answer is still no, Zack said, grinning. See? Pressure ineffective. I agreed with this creepy blood magic stuff because I honestly think you're right. We're too slow at figuring out primordial prisons. Only distasteful, unconventional methods like this can let us find a shortcut we need. Fair enough, Zorian said. Personally, he did not find blood magic to be that creepy, and even viewed it as a potentially useful tool for usage outside the time loop, but he understood where Zack was coming from. They spent 2 more hours discussing various ideas before they both entered the pocket dimension inside the Imperial Orb for a very important task. They had to convince Princess to let Zorian examine how her mind worked without trying to bite his head off for his insolence. It would prove to be a very challenging task. As days went by, some curious things began to be noticed by various countries of Koth, Xlotic and Altasia. The first one was that House Tar'amatula suddenly organized and launched a major expedition to Blantyre in order to find the fabled imperial staff of Ecosia, sinking a massive amount of money and manpower into the endeavor. The level of support House Tar'amatula had given to the project was not as extensive as Daemon had hoped, but it was still major by virtually any means, and the frantic speed with which the whole thing was organized and executed was enough to give others pause. The Tar'amatula seemed almost desperate to track down the staff, and nobody could figure out why. The leadership of the house declined to answer any questions regarding the matter, contributing to the air of mystery. More importantly, the Tar'amatula displayed the ability to open cross-continental dimensional passages between their land and their base in Blantyre. This was not something Zack and Zorian wanted to make known, but proved to be utterly impossible to hide, given the scale of the operation. This information soon spread around like a wildfire throughout various spy agencies, especially ones based in Koth, who were immediately consumed by an intense desire to know everything possible about the situation. Amusingly, this included trying to track down information about the Imperial staff. They thought the Imperial artifacts were just historical curiosities, but since the Tar'amatula wanted the staff so badly, there had to be something special about it. Many people suddenly wanted to get their hands on the Imperial staff, or at least hoped to understand what sort of power their rivals would possess should they successfully claim the item. Zack and Zorian intended to steal the results of all such research near the end of the restart. Who knows, maybe the combined might of all these spy agencies would find something they had overlooked. The second thing that got people's attention, especially in Altasia, was intricate spell formula schematics, alchemical recipes, new spell compendiums and sensitive spy reports that started to surface all over the continent. Nobody knew who was responsible for this, how they had come up with all this in complete secrecy, or what their motives were. And it was completely unknown just how many people had received this assistance, considering many people had simply accepted their gifts quietly and set out to exploit them in secret. Finally, the gifts seemed to be most heavily concentrated in Eldamar, which was a huge concern for everyone around them. This caused a frenzy of speculation and activity across the continent, as people tried to figure out what this meant and how to hopefully take advantage of it. This was, of course, done by Zack and Zorian. They did it for a very simple reason: to muddy the waters and prevent their newly marked fellow time travelers from standing out too much. It was too much to expect all of them to behave themselves at all times or never make a blunder, especially in this first restart while they were still under heavy impression of their first repeat of the month. Introducing enough waves into their surroundings would hopefully keep most people too busy with other matters to pay attention to crazy stories of time-traveling academy professors and the like. Thus far, the idea seemed to be working, but it would remain to be seen if that would hold out until the end. This done, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to organizing the search for the Imperial staff in Blantyre. While the bulk of the job was done by Daemon and his men, it was a necessity for Zack and Zorian to get regularly involved. For one thing, the descriptions of the Imperial staff were vague and contradictory, so they were the only ones that could identify the staff with any degree of certainty, thanks to their ability to sense the presence of the key. Additionally, they were necessary for transporting people and supplies all over Blantyre, since they were the only ones that could easily open dimensional gates from one location to another. Zorian had been quietly hoping that the immense amount of resources they had mobilized in the search would provide quick results, but his hopes were soon dashed upon the rocks of reality. Finding the staff turned out to be much Much harder than finding a book or a gate. The gates were rare and obscure, but fairly distinctive. The staff, on the other hand, was something incredibly common and bluntire. The lizardmen loved their staves. They were a popular symbol of authority, and virtually any lizardman ruler and priest had a staff to call their own. While this meant that the imperial staff probably hadn't been thrown away and forgotten in some ancient treasury, it also meant that tracking it down was akin to searching for a needle in a haystack. The one saving grace was that the imperial staff was free of most decorations, being just a plain piece of dark wood, whereas the lizardmen liked to decorate their own staves with gems and feathers and whatnot. Then again, what was to stop the new owner from adding those things to the imperial staff to pretty it up? Ugh. Influenced by such things, Zack and Zorian decided to approach Quatachachul for lessons again. Originally they wondered if they should skip their interaction with him in this particular restart, due to all the new time loopers suddenly working around, but in the end they decided they would risk it. This time, the topic they chose was tracking magic and search spells. This was a relatively safe topic to ask about, and it might help them find the staff faster. A foolish hope, probably, considering the staff was immune to normal divination, just like all the other imperial artifacts. However, Quatachachul was familiar with divine energies in a way that others couldn't match, so perhaps he knew of a way it could be done. The topic was also potentially useful in tracking down Red Robe once they were outside the time loop, and it might give them an answer about how Quatachachul had managed to detect their presence at the end of the previous restart. Zorian really wanted an answer to that last question, since he had thought his privacy wards were pretty much flawless at this point. It was really unfortunate that he had been unable to find out anything of worth when he broke through Quatachachul's mental defenses, Zorian thought gloomily. While he was extremely proficient at performing memory probes by now, that type of magic took a long time to really get going, and the ancient lich had given him very little time to work with before abandoning his body. He probably shouldn't have tried to find out where Quatachachul's phylactery was located. That kind of information was incredibly important, and was thus bound to be guarded with the greatest possible zeal. He should have gone for something fairly mundane. Maybe Quatachachul would have been willing to risk things and spend more time struggling against his mental probe. At the moment, though, Zack and Zorian were in the time magic research facility beneath Ceuria. The two of them were disguised as adult agents of the Crown, and were having a private talk with Cranton Keklas, the head researcher and overseer of the facility. Cranton was slowly turning the Imperial orb in his hands, utterly fascinated with it. "You understand that we require your complete silence about this matter, don't you, Mr. Keklas?" Zorian asked him. The man suddenly looked up, a slightly confused look on his face. He had evidently been so absorbed in his study of the orb that he had lost track of time. Oh yes, I absolutely understand the need for secrecy, Crampton quickly said, nodding furiously. "I assure you, me and my team are quite used to working on top-secret projects and dealing with potential leaks." He took another long look at the orb in his hands. "This thing. It's absolutely amazing," he said, obvious admiration in his voice. "I cannot put into words how glad I am to be given this honor. I hope you remember you are not being given this orb just to satisfy your personal curiosity," Zack said gruffly. He was playing the bad guy in their fake royal agent scheme. "We have given you this honor because you are our nation's foremost expert on black rooms, and we hope you can turn this pocket dimension into the largest one yet. Can you do it or not?" "Yes, absolutely," Crampton said. "While the volume of space inside is larger than anything we have ever done, the isolation from the outside world is also unprecedented. We can definitely turn this into a temporal dilation zone." Just? Zorian prompted. Well, "This is a very ambitious undertaking you are proposing here," Crampton said, stumbling over the words slightly. Zorian could feel that, although Crampton was a little nervous, he was also determined to make the absolute most out of this opportunity he was presented with. "To create this thing you are proposing, we would have to considerably expand the research facility and design whole new methods of black room construction. While I am sure we can do it eventually, the amount of time involved is not small. We are a very small team and, you want more money," Zack said bluntly, cutting him off. "And people," Crampton nodded. He seemed to sense this was important to them. In that case, he felt it was entirely appropriate to ask for increased commitment in terms of resources and available staff. Zorian did not answer verbally. He just reached into his jacket and handed Crampton a promissory note from one of the local banks. He could have brought actual cash too, of course, but he knew by now that government facilities like this rarely dealt with such things and that dumping large stacks of paper money on them would be a huge mistake. It would raise all sorts of red flags in their heads. Crampton wordlessly accepted the promissory note and glanced at it. He raised his eyebrow at the number printed on it. Zorian could tell he was appreciative, but not really impressed. "This is just the initial sum to get you started, of course," Zorian said. "You will get further funding once things actually start moving forward, as well as additional bonuses if the project is going particularly well." "Of course," Crampton said, slightly more impressed. "In regards to additional staff, that is a bit more complex," Zorian said. "Due to the somewhat abrupt nature of this initiative, it will take at least a month before we can send some new people here on a permanent basis." "That's fine," Crampton said easily. "I can wait a month or several. Just be aware that the longer it takes for additional manpower to arrive, the more the project will stall." "I wasn't finished," Zorian said, shaking his head. "Although we cannot send people here officially, you will get several mages skilled in dimensionalism to help you move faster with the project. Specifically, the man would be getting Xveem, Silver Lake, Zack and Zorian. With their expertise in dimensionalism and with the research facility staff's experience in constructing black rooms, the project would hopefully result in something useful after a few restarts." Crampton didn't seem to like the idea, however. "I don't like experts outside my authority coming here, telling me how to run things," he told them bluntly. "Even if they're highly capable, they don't know the wider context of why we do things the way we do. They would just slow things down and create confusion." "Are you the facility overseer or not?" Zack challenged. "Are you telling me that you cannot keep a couple of new arrivals in line or bring them up to speed in a timely manner?" Crampton frowned at him, giving him a slightly angry look. "These people are being sent here as help," Zorian said in a conciliatory tone. "If, after talking to them, you feel they contribute nothing of worth to the project, you are free to send them away. Just remember that their help has already been factored into our projections on how long the project will take," Zack warned. "Very well," Crampton said, a little unhappily. "I shall give these people a chance, at least. We will see if they are as good as you say they are." It took them another hour to arrange everything. Zack and Zorian handed Crampton a whole stack of official documentation, which the man merely glanced at before handing it over to the rest of his staff. He evidently didn't even consider the idea that this was all just an elaborate ruse. Zorian hoped the people actually in charge of processing the documentation would be every bit as careless as their overseer, because many of the documents wouldn't stand up to detailed scrutiny. "Well," Crampton eventually breathed out. "This has certainly been a productive evening. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?" "Actually, yes," Zorian nodded, handing the man another folder full of documents. "There's been a change in regards to the group that is planned to take advantage of the next Black Room period. This wasn't how Zack and Zorian usually took over the black room beneath Sioria when they wanted to use it. Normally they just disabled the true group and then showed up with bogus documents at the last possible moment, giving the facility staff little time to consider the issue. This time, however, they planned to bring an entire group with them. Thus, they had taken time to arrange things a little more thoroughly. Oh! The Reddens group decided to cancel their scheduled black room use? Crampton said, skimming through the folder. Strange, they were all so enthusiastic about the whole thing. He gave them a knowing look. He clearly knew there was some foul play involved here, but he probably thought it was the government bullying a group into dropping their claim rather than some kind of deception. He shook his head sadly, throwing the folder to the side. "I'm curious," he said. "This orb, the sudden changes in resource allocations and the like. Are they related to these mysterious gifts I keep hearing about through the rumor mill?" "Ha! We aren't paid to ask those kind of questions, and neither are you," Zack told him grimly. "But probably," added Zorian. Zack gave him a warning look in response. He was a pretty good actor, all things considered. Did he used to do this sort of thing a lot during past restarts, or was he just a natural? "All right, I understand. Forget I asked," Crampton said, rising from his seat. "I guess we should both get back to our jobs. When can I expect these experts of yours?" 3 days from now, Zorian said. "That should be enough to see if the ruse worked or not. We will also periodically drop by to check your progress and see if you need anything. Give me sufficient resources and I'll give you what you want," Crampton assured them. Zorian had no doubt about that. The real question was whether the results would come fast enough to be of any use. He also swore mentally that if Crampton really produced impressive results with what they've given him, he would find a way to reward him for it in the real world. Somehow. Break. In a typical restart, Zack and Zorian had a habit of holding meetings in all sorts of different places: parks, taverns, abandoned houses, houses under construction, tiny caves in the middle of the wilderness. They usually made a choice based on pure impulse and convenience. The novelty of holding a meeting in a new location was also a welcome reprieve from the soul-crushing sameness that dominated the time loop. Now, however, they had a lot more people participating in these kinds of meetings. This completely changed their usual dynamic. They couldn't decide these kinds of things on a whim anymore. They now had to find a space big enough to hold all of them in relative comfort and make sure everyone could gather there in a timely manner. Public places were pretty much out of consideration. A group of a dozen people of a variety of ages and occupations, plus some giant spiders, would turn heads wherever they went. Additionally, Ilsa got angry at them when they tried to arrange for a meeting in a cold, damp cave in the middle of uninhabited wilderness. Zorian didn't understand what the big deal was. The centipede that tried to climb up her leg was less than a finger thick and the bats didn't bother anyone, but afterwards everyone agreed to only hold meetings in actual buildings. Thus, the two of them eventually decided to just hold all the meetings at the Nevada estate. The place had plenty of empty, spacious rooms and very good privacy wards already in place. Though Zack complained that it was the boring choice, he agreed with Zorian that organizing meetings elsewhere was more trouble than it was worth. Thus, at this moment, there was a huge group of people gathered in one of the larger meeting rooms in the Nevada estate. The actual meeting was already over by this point, but the group had not disbanded for the day. Instead they had mostly broken up into smaller groups that discussed things of mutual interest between themselves. In one corner, the emissary from the filigree sages was having a loud and enthusiastic discussion with Nora Boole. The female spell formula teacher did not seem to mind that she was talking to a giant spider and instead relished the chance to discuss her field of study with a kindred soul. The filigree sage's emissary, meanwhile, seemed immensely pleased to have found a human mage that was interested in their branded spell formula. The two of them seemed completely oblivious to their surroundings and the passage of time, so consumed they were in their discussion. Not far from them, Alanik and Chiron had covered a table full of various maps and were staring at it in silence. Every once in a while they would point at a random spot on the map and speak a few curt words at each other before falling silent again. Zorian couldn't figure out anything from their brief, mysterious exchanges. In all likelihood, neither could anyone else. Everyone seemed to be giving them a wide berth. In the other corner, Zack was having a loud discussion with the emissary from the Luminous Advocates. This one was less friendly than the one between Norabul and the Filigree Sage's emissary, though. Zack seemed to be trying to convince the Luminous Advocates to tutor him in mind magic, while the emissary was stubbornly pointing out that Zack wasn't psychic and that this would be a waste of time. Zorian suspected Zack would get his way in the end. Luminous Advocates were a lot less prideful with them after experiencing the time loop in person, and they now knew exactly how powerful Zack was. They knew they couldn't afford to piss him off, and Zack was unlikely to quit once he set his mind on something, so they would probably cave in eventually. Whether anything would come out of such a lesson was something Zorian was a lot less sure about. Not too far from them, a small group consisting of Kale, Taven, Lucav and Damon was sorting through the various rare materials Zack and Zorian gathered and exchanging stories. The talk seemed to be pretty mundane, focusing on amusing anecdotes and such. One of the tables was completely monopolized by Silver Lake, poring over their documents related to their study of the Ebeson Gate. Zorian was pretty surprised at her behavior in this restart, in all honesty. She seemed far more enthusiastic and open about helping them now. It was interesting how dramatically she changed once she experienced the time loop with her own eyes. Finally, there was Zorian. Like Silver Lake, he wasn't really interacting with anyone at the moment. Instead, he was inspecting a table full of divine artifacts that they had stolen for study. He had never made any progress in figuring out these things, but he certainly wasn't about to give up. Especially since Quatachichil had given them definite confirmation that it was possible to at least detect divine energies with regular magic. Eventually his solitude was broken by Xvim, who walked up to his table and sat down on the chair next to him. He looked faintly displeased. "Problems?" Zorian asked. "I have a newfound appreciation for the amount of patience you and Mr. Nevada possess," he said blandly. "I've just spent the entire morning marking down a stack of student homework that was absolutely identical to what I had already done in the previous restart and realized this would happen a lot." An unpleasant realization. "Huh?" Zorian said. "You can always just ignore it." Xvim shook his head. "That would go against my professional pride," he said. "Just as I demand dedication from my students, I demand the same from myself. A little thing like this should not break me. I shall treat it as personal tempering, I suppose." "I see," Zorian said, nodding. "I suppose you'd be quite a hypocrite if, after subjecting your students to such an infuriating initial treatment, you ended up losing your patience after only a handful of repeating months." Xvim hummed in response, not giving a verbal response. He glanced at the divine artifact Zorian was inspecting. "You realize, I'm sure, that no one has ever managed to figure out how divine artifacts actually work?" Xvim asked. "Of course," Zorian said. "But very few people had the opportunity to take one apart over and over again as a method of study. Still, I'm surprised you're wasting time on this," Xvim remarked. "Wouldn't it be wiser to spend more time on time loop-related things?" "I would actually classify this as very much a time loop-related thing," Zorian answered. "The time loop clearly works at least partially with the help of divine energies. Who's to say they aren't involved with our markers? Oh, Xvim asked, suddenly more interested. It's just baseless speculation, Zorian said. But I've been thinking about what Red Robe could possibly have that other past controllers didn't that would allow him to break the limitations placed on temporary markers, and the most likely answer I've come up with is Quatachichil. I suspect divine energies are involved with the marker somehow, and that the reason Red Robe had been able to alter it is because he had Quatachichil's help. His method of perceiving and possibly modifying divine energies may have allowed him to tamper with the marker in ways that are impossible to us. In which case our efforts to understand and modify the marker are doomed to fail right from the very start. I hope you are not right about that, Xvim said after a short pause. Quatachichil has been alive for centuries. Who knows how long it took him to develop such capabilities? Zorian had nothing to say to that. Chapter 088 Mysterious Ways. With the palace orb handed to the time magic researchers for study and experimentation, Princess had temporarily lost her home. They weren't going to leave her in there while the researchers tinkered with the pocket dimension. That would probably end in tragedy, and they still needed her to intimidate the Salrotham tribes into allying with them, anyway. Although Princess herself was not particularly heartbroken about being away from the orb, the situation did make moving her around a bit of a chore. She couldn't live in the desert. While she could tolerate dry areas, she needed plenty of water to rest in. Thus, Zack and Zorian mostly kept her deep in the Gothic wilderness, where she was happily terrorizing the jungle wildlife, and used dimensional portals to move her where they needed her. Thankfully, while Princess was huge, she was also serpentine in build and very flexible. She could squeeze herself through surprisingly small openings. However, this still meant Zack and Zorian had to expand their dimensional gates to far greater sizes than they typically used, greatly increasing casting time and mana costs involved. Princess did have her own, divinely granted teleportation abilities. They had experimented with them somewhat, trying to see if the Hydra had underutilized her gifts somehow, but they were disappointed in the end. Her teleportation powers were exactly what they appeared to be, a short-range teleport ability that Princess could use for entering and leaving the palace orb, as well as tactical positioning during battles. It was incapable of transporting her across large distances. The logistics of Hydra transport aside, their alliance building was moving along extremely well. The Salrotham tribes they were visiting were both less secure and less prosperous than the Ziggurat tribe. Their settlements had no defensive wards, they had no guardian beast on the level of the divinely touched Sandworm, and their equipment was far shoddier than what Zack and Zorian were used to. Thus, when a pair of powerful human mages came to them, riding on a gigantic 8-headed Hydra and handing out gifts, none of them dared to simply snub them. Not all of them were eager to work with them, but all of them at least agreed to hear them out. It helped that this time they had brought an actual Salrotham language specialist to translate for them. The bearded, middle-aged man had only agreed to work with them after Zack and Zorian used Nilu and her family connections to guarantee their trustworthiness. But he had been worth the trouble. Not only was he proficient in the hand language that Salrotham normally used for their communication with humans, he even understood some of their native clicking and buzzing that they used to talk to each other. Though he couldn't actually speak it, of course. Curiously, the man was completely non-magical. Ebrik, as he was called, claimed that spells were of little help to him in his job. They only put the Salrotham on edge, as many of them were wary of talking to mages. The devil wasps had great difficulty distinguishing spell chants from mundane conversations, so any time a known spellcaster started speaking they would be viewed with great suspicion. At the moment, Zack, Zorian, Ebik and Princess were approaching another of the Salrotham tribes for recruitment. This one was particularly underwhelming, however, and Zorian privately wondered if they should even bother. The settlement was just a series of circular holes dug into a cliff, and Zorian had seen enough of such places by now to estimate the number of Sul'Rothum living there. The tribe probably had less than 100 members total. Since the group had done nothing to mask their approach and Princess was very eye-catching, the Sul'Rothum scouts had long since spotted them and the entire tribe was a nervous hive of activity. This allowed Zorian to take a look at the decorations and weapons the group was sporting, and he was not impressed with what he was seeing. "Why are all these tribes so much worse than the Ziggurat one?" Zack asked out loud. He probably did not expect an answer, but surprisingly Ebuk had an answer. "Because of the dungeon access," Ebuk said. Zack and Zorian shot him curious looks, not really understanding. While humans like to build their cities on top of accessible dungeon layers, most other species do not, as their less sophisticated magical expertise makes them less capable of dealing with creatures crawling out of the dungeon on a regular basis, Ebuk clarified. The Sul'Rothum living in the Ziggurat of the Sun are an exception, probably because of the giant sandworm you mentioned. The creature probably allowed them to reshape their local underground the same way human communities do, letting them exploit the place in relative safety. The other tribes do not have that, and thus appear underwhelming in comparison. "Huh," Zack said thoughtfully. "I guess that sandworm is even more important than we thought. The wasps really lucked out with that thing." Before anyone could continue the discussion, Princess released a warbling cry and pointed one of her heads towards a spot on the horizon where a group of Sul'Rothum was flying towards them. Zorian frowned at the sight. He wasn't surprised that Princess had noticed them before anyone else. She had 8 pairs of eyes and was intensely vigilant by nature, but the direction they were coming from and their numbers were unexpected. They were coming from their left, rather than the Sul'Rothum settlement in front of them, and there were 12 Sul'Rothum in the approaching group. An emissary from a different tribe, Zorian guessed. He doubted the tiny settlement in front of them would send out a hunting party as large as this. And if they did, the group would first enter their home to consult with their elders before confronting them. "Probably," Zack said. "I hope this becomes a thing in the future. This would go so much smoother if the surrounding tribes started coming to us instead of the other way around." As they grew closer to Princess and the humans accompanying her, the Sul'Rothum group eventually slowed down and landed in the area in front of them. The Sul'Rothum chose a spot that was a fair distance away from their own, trying to make their entrance seem less threatening. But in the end they did effectively block their path and Princess instantly became outraged at the temerity of these newcomers. If Zack hadn't hurriedly calmed her down, she would have already been charging at them, heads roaring a battle cry. In the end the two groups silently agreed to meet in the middle and negotiate. Zack, Zorian and Ebuk ordered Princess to stay in the back and loom over the meeting threateningly, while the apparent Sul'Rothum leader took 2 bodyguards with him and ordered the rest to similarly stay in the back and look intimidating. Zorian was kind of biased, but he felt that Princess decidedly won the aggressive posturing competition. For the next 10 minutes, Ebuk and the Sul'Rothum leader exchanged words while Zorian took the chance to study the group that sought them out. They were pretty impressive by Sul'Rothum standards, he realized. They were all armed with iron spears and decorated with plenty of war paint, trinkets and various magical charms. The only person that wasn't armed was their leader, who carried a plethora of metal rings and chains but no weapons. He also had a particularly large number of charm bundles hanging off of him, some of which actually looked like they might be doing something. Zorian immediately pegged him as a priest. After a while the talking died down and Ebuk turned to them awkwardly. Zorian could immediately tell that he didn't have good news for them, though the Sul'Rothum themselves remained not aggressive. "Curious. What is it?" Zack prompted. "This group here comes from the Ziggurat of the Sun," Ebuk said slowly. Oh. He did think those spears were kind of familiar. However, weapons like that were hardly unique to the Ziggurat tribe, so he thought nothing of it. They know we want to attack them, huh? Zack mused out loud. It wasn't that unexpected, Zorian supposed. It wasn't like they were being low-key in their alliance building. Quite the opposite, really. With that in mind, it was probably inevitable that the Ziggurat tribe would detect their plans long before the actual attack was executed. Since their goal was to lure the High Priest out of the Ziggurat and not to catch the Sul'Rathum by surprise, this wasn't something they cared much about. Still, they hadn't expected the Ziggurat tribe to seek them out for a friendly chat. Try to ambush them, maybe, but not this. Yes, Eba confirmed. They want to know what it would take for you to call your attack off. What, no threats? Zack asked curiously. No, said Ebik, shaking his head. Just questions about your motives. Not that I know much about that myself, of course. Zack ignored the accusatory tone in Ebik's last sentence. While he probably wouldn't betray them to the Sul'Rathum, it wouldn't make them look any less crazy or mysterious if they told him they were doing all this for a magic ring. How do they know we don't want to simply take away their Ziggurat? Zack asked. Ask them that. That's. Are you trying to start a fight with them? Ebik asked incredulously. I want to see how they react, Zack said. Just do it. Ebik muttered something that sounded like a curse in his native language and then started conversing with the Sul'Rathum priest again. Interestingly, the Sul'Rathum did not visibly react to the question at all. It wasn't long before Ebik turned to them again. They say 3 of us are not enough for that, Ebik said. That you would have brought an army with you if you wanted to occupy something. The Sul'Rathum priest made another series of hand gestures. They think you want something smaller. Something portable. They acknowledge your strength but wonder if a trade wouldn't be preferable to bloodshed. What we want they would never trade away, Zorian said, shaking his head. Should they tell them they were after the ring? No, that might make it harder to lure the High Priest out of the Ziggurat later. But maybe he would actually agree to hand it to them if he thought it would ward off a catastrophic attack on his tribe. The ring was important, but it wasn't like they were asking him to hand over the sandworm-controlled dagger or something. Tell them this is not something they are qualified to negotiate about, Zack suddenly said. We want to talk to their High Priest. Zorian raised his eyebrow at Zack. Did he really think it would be that easy? A furious exchange of hand gestures occurred between Ebik and the Sul'Rathum priest, after which Ebik turned to them again. They say they are also not qualified to bring strangers before their elders, Ebik said. They are here merely to find out what you're after and if the conflict can be averted. After that, they will report back to their tribe and receive further orders. They say meeting the leaders of the tribe may be possible, but you have to give them something to bring back if you wish for that to happen. Zack and Zorian looked at each other briefly. A quiet exchange of telepathic communication occurred between them and they quickly came to an agreement. I guess that makes sense, Zack admitted out loud. Zorian reached into his pocket and retrieved a metal watch from it. Using a quick alteration spell, he melted the portion of the casing and shaped it into a replica of the Imperial ring before handing it over to Ebik. Tell them to hand this over to the High Priest as our response, Zorian said. He'll understand, Zack added. Ebik raised his eyebrow at them but did as he was told. The Sul'Rathum priest hesitantly accepted the ring, turning it in his chitinous hands. He seemed rather dubious about the explanation he was given, staring at both Zack and Zorian with his large faceted eyes in a searching manner, antennae nervously twitching in all directions. After a while, he carefully placed the replica ring in one of the many leather pouches hanging off his body and nodded to them in a very human manner. He then waved towards his bodyguards, signaling they were done here. Apparently he realized this was all he would be getting out of them. A few minutes later the entire Solrotham group lifted into the air again and rapidly flew away in the same direction they came from. The humans silently watched their retreat for a while, before Ebuk decided to speak up. "You brats are too damn mysterious about everything," he groused. "I don't even know why I agreed to this." "You're getting paid handsomely for this," Zack pointed out. "Yet I'm still starting to regret this," Ebuk said. He looked towards the Solrotham settlement in the distance. "Incidentally, there is another group of Solrotham incoming. This time from the settlement we were going to visit before we got interrupted by this one." Zorian looked towards the settlement and noticed that Ebuk was correct. The local Solrotham did not dare interrupt the Ziggurat tribe emissaries while they were talking to Zorian and others, but now that they were gone, they seemed to be hurriedly assembling their own emissary group to intercept them. "Are we still going to talk to them about allying against the Ziggurat tribe?" Ebuk asked. "I don't see why not," Zack said, shrugging. "There is no guarantee that the High Priest will accept our message in good grace. If we thought it would be that simple to get what we want, we wouldn't have started down this path to begin with. We'll keep gathering forces, putting pressure on him while he considers what to do." Break. Neither Zack nor Zorian really thought the High Priest would capitulate and hand them the ring without a fight. On the contrary, they felt sure it would make their task of eventually obtaining the ring far harder in this restart. However, on the off chance it did work, it would be pretty much an ideal solution to obtaining the ring in future restarts. Thus, they decided to give it a try anyway. They didn't expect to be approached by the same emissary group the very next day, inviting them to the Ziggurat to talk with the High Priest. Ebuk cautioned them against accepting the offer. It was an obvious trap, he said. However, Zack and Zorian did not care. Even if the meeting was just an excuse to ambush them, they still had to go. They were far more powerful than either Ebuk or the Solrotham High Priest realized, and were unlikely to die. As long as they met the High Priest face to face and he had a ring on him, they would get what they wanted, one way or another. Unfortunately, Ebuk adamantly refused to follow them into the Ziggurat, calling them suicidal fools. Zorian understood the man's attitude. Ebuk couldn't possibly know just how capable he and Zack really were, so his concerns were well warranted. However, this didn't make things any less frustrating, and the argument was rapidly becoming heated. The Ziggurat tribe emissary calmly observed the argument for a few minutes before casting some sort of spell. Both Zack and Zorian instantly became worried, but it quickly became obvious that the Solrotham priest was casting magic on himself. The spell was far lengthier and ritualized than what Zorian was used to when dealing with human and Iranian mages, involving nearly a minute of buzzing and gesturing, and at the end of it the Solrotham priest burned a handful of scented materials as some kind of offering to the heavens. An entirely superfluous gesture as far as Zorian could tell, not impacting the spellcasting results at all. This done, the emissary straightened himself up and faced them again. "The fight, unnecessary," he declared with a somewhat distorted but perfectly understandable human voice. "Talk, still possible. No need to pressure a companion." Zack and Zorian stared at the Solrotham for a while before Zack spoke up again. "You could have done this right from the start and you let us talk through a translator all this time?" he asked. The Solrotham's antenna twitched nervously as he tried to decipher Zack's words. "He clearly has only a rudimentary knowledge of the Kojin tongue," Ebuk said in an exasperated manner. "It makes perfect sense for him to prefer conversing with me, using more familiar hand gestures, than bothering with this. My speech, poor," the emissary added. "High Priest, much better. Will be enough until we reach temple." After some more discussion, Zack and Zorian agreed to leave Ebuk and followed the Solrotham back to the Ziggurat. Despite their worries, they were not attacked at any point in the journey, not even when they entered the ziggurat itself. Instead, the emissary dutifully led them through the empty corridors and straight into the temple, where the high priest and his honor guard waited for them. Zorian was honestly a little surprised. The Sul'Rathum had actually brought them in front of their high priest, just as they had promised. Sure, the room was also packed full of heavily armed guards and several lesser priests, but it did not seem like they were walking into an ambush. The Sul'Rathum were tense and agitated, but they did not move to attack them. The high priest stood proudly in front of the huge sacred fire that served as the heart of the temple. Situated at the top of a large stone dais, the fire illuminated the entire place in a dull orange glow. The air was uncomfortably hot and dry, even though Zack and Zorian had spent their time traveling through a scorching desert just before coming here. From his elevated position, the Sul'Rathum high priest silently stared down on them, his multifaceted eyes unblinkingly studying their every move. A deathly, uncomfortable silence soon descended on the scene. For several minutes, the two sides simply stood in their spots without making a move. Even Zack remained patient and unmoving, reluctant to make the first move. Finally, the high priest seemed to reach a decision. He reached towards one of his hands and removed a familiar ring from it. He then placed it on his palm and thrust it towards them decisively. "Take it," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, and echoed dramatically throughout the room. "Just like that?" Zack asked curiously. "You do not want it?" the high priest asked. "We want it," Zack said. "I'm just a little surprised by your behavior." "I mirror your sentiments, human," the high priest declared. "I, too, am a little surprised by your behavior. If you wanted the ring, why did you not just come here and ask for it? Why bother with the hostilities?" Zack looked at him like he was stupid. "What are you talking about?" Zorian said. "Are you saying you'd have given us the ring if we had simply walked in here and asked you to?" "Of course," the high priest said. "We are children of angels. What child dares defy its parents?" "The angels?" repeated Zorian confusingly. The high priest stared at them silently for a few seconds. "As I thought," he said, lowering the hand that held the ring. "You do not know." "No, we really don't," Zack freely admitted. "What are you talking about? Have you tried to contact the angels recently?" the high priest asked. Zorian raised an eyebrow at him. "What a ridiculous idea. As if anyone could just contact the angels to have a friendly chat of something. Besides, the spirit world cannot be contacted at the moment," Zorian said. "Ah, so you do know that much at least," the high priest said, his antennae waving in the air lazily. "Good. Just before the angels fell silent, they graced us with their presence and gave us a warning. They said that in the coming month, a powerful human mage may arrive here and ask for the ring. If that were to happen, we are to simply hand it over without struggle." Zack and Zorian stayed silent, digesting the explanation. Angels specifically instructed the Sul'Rathum to hand over the ring to them? Well, to the TimeLoop controller, really. To Zack. Did that mean that angels were the ones to give Zack the marker? It would certainly explain how Zack could have gotten a divine blessing when such things were supposed to be all but extinct in modern times. Why would the angels tell you to do such a thing? Zack frowned. "I don't know," the high priest said, cocking his head to the side like a curious bird. "You should tell me. Well, did they actually give you a description of this powerful human mage?" Zack asked agitatedly. "Did they leave some kind of message for him?" "No descriptions, no message," the high priest responded curtly. "However, they did assure us not to worry about the loss of the ring. They said that in the end, the loss would be just a temporary matter." Before Zack and Zorian could say anything else, the high priest threw the ring at them. Zack caught it in his hand and inspected it. However, that was largely pointless. Zorian could tell through his marker that the ring was genuine, and so could Zack. "The heavens instruct the children to be," the high priest stated. "You have what you came here for. You may leave now." This was apparently the end of the meeting, because then the regular priest soon came to them, and politely but insistently ushered them out of the ziggurat. Break. Somewhere in the jungles of Blantyre, not far from the coast, was an unremarkable dirt trail made by the local lizardmen. This was normally a quiet and rarely used road, but today this sleepy peace was shattered by an entire group of humans loudly and messily trudging through the region. Though sheer manpower and powerful magic, they cut down the vegetation that threatened to overgrow the path and continued inexorably towards their destination. This was Damon and his personal team looking for rumors about the Imperial staff. This time, Zack and Zorian had decided to tag along with them for a while. It had been 4 days since they had managed to obtain the Imperial ring from the Soldar Thumb, and they were still somewhat under the impression of what they had heard in the ziggurat. They didn't know what to think about the whole incident. Clearly the angels were aware that the time loop was going to be activated and took at least some precautions in regards to that. Did that mean they were behind the whole thing? Zack certainly did not remember even talking to an angel, much less receiving any sort of instructions from them. Of course, it was possible that Red Robe was responsible for that, having erased Zack's memory of that for some reason. But then one couldn't help but ask why they didn't plan for that possibility and leave a message for him through one of their other servants. The ring situation proved they were both capable and willing to make such contingencies when it suited them, so why not for other things as well? There were no easy answers for that. Even Olenek admitted that this sort of thing did not make much sense to him, though he did not seem to be too disturbed. "The angels work in mysterious ways," he said, "since they labor under many limitations and restrictions placed on them by the gods. Many times they simply couldn't do the logical thing, or even tell you why they are acting the way they do. One just had to have faith that they knew what they were doing and not rely on them too much. Well, at least this way they had a trivially easy way of recovering the Imperial ring." "See, I told you Princess was the solution," Zack said, spinning the Imperial ring on his finger. "This is not how you expected things to go and we both know it," Zorian told him firmly. He looked over to the side where Kerma was fiddling with the brand new divination compass Zorian had made for her. "So? What do you think?" She didn't answer for a moment, opting to instead cast a quick series of divinations through the device before turning it in her hands a few more times. Like her old one, it was flower-shaped and made of metal, but with a much denser array of spell formula. Zorian was pretty sure his work was a massive improvement on what she had been working with up until now, but high-level diviners were finicky, and what worked for him might not necessarily work for her. "Very impressive," she finally concluded. "A bit bigger and heavier than I'm used to, but I can work with this. It feels a little weird to accept something this valuable for free, though." "Free?" Tehran scoffed from their side. One of the floating eyeballs that followed him swiveled towards them while Tehran simply kept scanning the jungle canopy for something. He had a bad habit of not looking people in the eye while talking to them, letting his floating eyeballs maintain eye contact instead. He's had all of us searching an entire continent worth of jungle for a straightened piece of wood without having to pay us a single thing. It was about time he started handing out gifts. "That's not very fair," Kerma protested. "We're also doing this for ourselves, not just for him. And I'm paying plenty of money to make this happen," Zorian pointed out. "Fake time loop money," Tehran said dismissively. "Doesn't count. Also, why don't I get a gift?" Taven suddenly asked, having snuck up to them from behind while they were taking. "Seriously, Zorian. You're handing out expensive gifts to strange women, but you don't have anything for your old pal Taven? Shame on you." Zorian looked at her, amused. He'd thought she was still busy gawking at the jungle sights, since this was the first time she had ever stepped foot in one, but apparently she had calmed down a little and decided to seek him out. Kerma gave Taven a less friendly look, since she apparently didn't like being labeled a strange woman out of the blue. "My gift to you is taking you with me to Blantyre, even though you have no useful skills for the mission and no wilderness survival experience," Zorian told her blandly. I guess that's true," she laughed nervously. "I really do appreciate it, though. Traveling to exotic lands, searching for ancient artifacts. This sort of expedition is exactly what I hope to one day experience. It's great. It's just too bad I can't put this on my job profile or something." She was entirely too giddy about the whole thing. On one hand, it was kind of annoying to have her dance around the whole group like an excited little girl. On the other hand, it kind of made him glad he had agreed to bring her along, since this clearly meant so much to her. At least she wasn't defenseless. The one time she had walked into a patch of carnivorous plants, she burned them all to ashes before anyone had even realized what had happened. Her inexperience aside, she was a decent combat mage. Eventually, the group soon reached their destination, a small lizardman village where they would supposedly find a reclusive sage that knew everything about the history of the region. While the everything was almost certainly an exaggeration, there was probably some sort of basis for his reputation, right? Right. The village was a humble one, with tiny houses made out of mud and straw. There was a river right next to it, and most of the adult villagers were currently busy tending to their boats, which they dragged onto the shore for easier handling. The children were either shuttling tools and materials between various work groups or chasing each other and play fighting, while their parents shouted something vaguely threatening at them. Probably telling them to stop messing around or demanding they get out of the way if they wouldn't help. Their arrival caused a small commotion in the group, but they were mostly curious rather than wary. Most lizardmen never saw a human in their entire life, Zorian had learned, so they did not know what to expect of them. Since the group was accompanied by lizardman guides hired in the nearby city-state and no one in the group carried an obvious weapon like a spear or a club, the villagers were not particularly frightened of them. Annoyingly, this meant that some of the braver children tried to examine them closer or even touch them. One of them specifically picked Zorian as a target, probably because he was one of the shorter humans present, and kept asking him something while poking him. Lizardman language sounded nothing like normal lizard hissing. It was more like a high-pitched, warbling bird song. Zorian understood none of it, but by peering into the kid's mind and listening to the snickering explanation of their lizardman guides, he managed to puzzle out that the child was asking him if he was a fairy. He hated this village already. In any case, the group eventually set up a small camp just outside the village, with most of the group just idling around while the leaders of the village exchanged gifts with daemon and went through various ceremonial gestures. The whole procedure was annoyingly lengthy, but apparently necessary. The reclusive sage they wanted to talk with was normally, well, reclusive. He wouldn't deign to meet most people, but perhaps if they could convince the village elders to put in a good word for them, he might give them a chance. Zorian was currently sitting on one of the cut-down logs on the outskirts of the village, watching some of the lizardman children fight the animated mud person he had created out of the ground to distract them from himself. Although the mud constructs had the size and strength comparable to an adult human, the truth was that humans were notably smaller and weaker than lizardmen. Their vaguely crocodilian frames were wider and larger than human ones, and their skin was covered in tough leathery scales. Thus, even though the mud construct's enemies were mere children, it was still being gradually overpowered. This was pretty much how Zorian had intended it to be, however. He didn't really want to hurt the little brats, even if they were loud, grabby and generally annoying. Not far from him, some enterprising lizardman woman had come to try and peddle her crafts and trinkets to the gathered humans, trying to exchange pottery and necklaces made out of colorful stones for metal tools and fabrics. She was currently negotiating with one of the female members of the group, each of them loudly talking at one another, even though neither spoke the other's language. He took off his glasses and started obsessively cleaning them. "Damn it, when was this damn meeting going to end?" "Why so impatient?" asked a voice beside him. "It is good to sit down from time to time and appreciate the simpler things in life." His heart skipped a beat when the voice started talking. He turned towards the source of the voice, shocked to find that there was suddenly a strange lizardman sitting next to him. And he did mean suddenly. The lizardman did not register at all on Zorian's mind sense and seemingly materialized out of nowhere when he started talking. He was also very, very weird looking. An intricate pattern of blue and white lines was painted over his whole body, and he wore what seemed to be a massive deer skull over the top of his head. A multitude of bone armbands, necklaces and ankle bands decorated his limbs and neck. Resting horizontally on his lap was a gnarled wooden staff with a huge pearl attached on top of it. His posture and appearance gave the impression of someone old and worn down, eyes half closed, scales cracked and faded in places, his posture hunched and drooping. Despite that, he inspired a faint feeling of terror in Zorian, who couldn't understand how he had been able to sneak up on him so easily. "I hear you've been looking for me," the lizardman said. He was speaking fluent Ecosian, which was kind of interesting but way down the list of questions Zorian wanted answered at the moment. "What? Oh, you're the sage we wanted to speak with," Zorian realized. "Indeed," the lizardman said, fiddling with one of the bone armbands while watching the children play with Zorian's mud construct. "I dislike this kind of attention, so I decided to just meet with one of you and be done with it." Zorian looked around and realized no one seemed to be paying attention to his conversation with the weird lizardman that had showed up out of nowhere. "Only you can see and hear me," he said casually. This was such bullshit. "Why did you pick me out of everyone else present?" Zorian asked with a small frown. "I like you," he said. "You took the time to play with the children. Don't you remember what I said earlier? It is good to sit down from time to time and appreciate the simpler things in life." Zorian looked at him incredulously, not sure if the lizardman was being serious or not. He had only made that toy so the children would let him rest in peace. "How did you sneak up on me?" Zorian couldn't help but ask. "I'm old," the lizardman said, tapping the staff in his lap with his scaly, clawed fingers. "Ancient. It's natural to have a couple of secrets." He did not offer to explain any further and Zorian did not press him. The staff was probably some kind of divine artifact. Zorian checked it out with his marker, just in case it was the one they were after. It wasn't. "What did you seek me out for?" the lizardman asked, his half-closed eye focusing more firmly on him. Zorian quickly described the origin and probable appearance of the staff to the old lizardman. The sage patiently listened to his explanation, saying nothing. He said nothing for nearly 15 minutes, seemingly lost in thought. Occasionally he whistled to himself softly in the native lizardman tongue, tapping on his various bone ornaments and drawing some kind of simple geometric diagrams in dirt. Zorian patiently waited for the lizardman to come to his senses again, not daring to interrupt his musings. Unfortunately, when the sage finally turned to him again, he did not have a favorable answer for him. "I cannot remember anything that would help you in your quest," the lizardman said, shaking his head sadly. The various bone necklaces hanging from his neck clinked softly at the movement. Zorian sighed. So much for that. However, The lizardman continued, "I have an idea where you might look for more knowledge on the matter, if you feel brave enough. This staff. It is a very valuable thing, yes?" "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "There is a particularly loathsome dragon mage terrorizing our people throughout the entire region and beyond," the sage said. "I don't know her name, but our people refer to her as the Violet-Eyed Disaster, the Covetous One, or Typhoon. For centuries she has preyed upon our communities, snatching away any item that catches her fancy and killing anyone that tried to bar her way. Many important artifacts have been lost to her. If this staff of yours is as important as it seems, she has probably tried to find it and knows a thing or two about its whereabouts. Perhaps it may already be in her possession." Zorian gave the lizardman an unamused look. An infamous dragon mage? There were few things in the world more dangerous than that. Feeling brave indeed. Still, the old guy's logic was sound and the idea was worth checking out. Didn't Zack already demonstrate the ability to kill Ogange, who was similarly an infamous dragon mage? So what do you? Zorian began to speak, only to realize the old lizardman was no longer there. He waved his hand through the air where the sage had been sitting next to him, but hit only empty space. Groaning audibly, Zorian wandered off to find Zack and Damon to inform them that arranging the meeting with the sage was no longer necessary. Break! Zorian woke up with a panicked scream as an endless deluge of ice-cold water poured on top of his head as he slept. Stumbling and flailing around in panic, he tried to jump out of bed, but the wet fabric clung to him and made him trip. He tumbled awkwardly to the floor, frantically trying to rub the water out of his eyes while searching for his glasses. When he had finally come to his senses and looked around, he found Kirill pressed into a corner of the room by the door, a large bucket clutched tightly in her hands. There was still water dripping from it onto the floor. "Kirill! What the hell are you doing?" Zorian shouted incredulously. You She stumbled, pacing nervously while clutching the bucket in her hands tightly. "I was trying to make you assume your true form." Zorian looked at her like she was crazy. Actually, scratch that, she was crazy. "True form?" he asked her. "What the hell are you on about? You just dumped a bucket of cold water on my head in the middle of the night. I read in the book that doppelgangers assume their true forms if you surprise them while they're sleeping," she said. "So, if you dump water on them when they're deep asleep, they'll drop their disguise and assume their true form." Zorian stared at her, unable to believe her explanation. "You think I'm a face changer?" Zorian asked her in a calm voice. "Why, you aren't acting like the Zorian I know," she said while staring at the ground and refusing to look at him. "You have all these friends all of a sudden. You didn't get angry at all when Amaya asked you about Damon and... You're way too nice to me." Zorian sighed and ran his hand through his wet hair to get it out of his eyes. He looked at the closed door, confused as to why the entire house hadn't woken up by now because of all the shouting, but then he remembered he had put pretty strong privacy wards on the room. "If you thought I was a doppelganger, you should have at least gotten someone to back you up when confronting me," Zorian told her. He made a couple of gestures and pressed his hands against his chest, evaporating most of the water out of his clothes. "You're too good at magic, too," Kirill added. "That's another thing that's weird. But, you didn't change forms, so I guess you really are Zorian." Zorian debated the merits of using an illusion to seemingly morph into some kind of grotesque monster right at that moment, but immediately discarded it as too cruel. As much as he wanted to rage and get back at her, she had good reasons for pulling off this stupid stunt. He was getting entirely too careless around her, it seemed. "Yes, I really am Zorian," he told her in an exasperated tone. He took the bucket from her hands and lifted her up before marching back to his bed and plopping her right on top of it. right on top of the wet part, that is. Why? She protested, immediately jumping off the bed and inspecting her suddenly wet behind. Punishment, Zorian said pitilessly. You did say I was too nice to you, no? She gave him an angry look but said nothing. Anyway, he said. I suppose I can tell you a little bit about what's going on and why things are so weird right now. Break, time march on. The search for the staff in Blantyre, the research on pocket dimensions and other points of interest, the training of people with the aid of black rooms and limitless resources. As the restarts started to accumulate, these and other projects started to gradually bear fruit. Just like that, another 5 restarts had passed.